never too early for Madeira. I don't believe it. My grandmother always used to say that she found it very hard that you had to wait until 11 o'clock for her first G&T. And when she reached the age of 90, she decided she could have it as early as she liked. We've got lots of people saying hello lots of people from America today. Lots of people, I don't know if you can see the chat.
I can, yes.
Have you got a drink? That's the other important thing.
I'm drinking water. Very boring.
Well, I hope you've got
I'm clean living these days.
A whiskey or something for later. Well, not at all, nothing at all. Are you completely off all intoxicants or not?
For the time being, I am. Just for the time being.
We had John Waters gave a talk a month or two ago, and he was talking about how he'd taken LSD again for the first time since I think the 60s.
Wow.
And whilst he said it was highly enjoyable, he wasn't planning on taking it again in his life.
Well, that's an indicator of how it went.
Well, it's an indicator. I mean, I haven't taken LSD since I was at school, and every year I think that this should be the year. Somehow it never is. Which is probably an indicator, but I think he's right that one has to take it again. But I don't know whether I need to wait until I'm in my 70s. But it's 8 o'clock. Good evening, everybody. Please do keep talking to us in the chat, telling us who you are and where you are and why you're here. It's also, let us start with the...
where did all the pen box go? Is that not here anymore?
There's pens over there.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome to the Last Tuesday Society. Welcome to East London. Walk through the door, grab a cocktail from Reese and Alley. Wander down into the gallery, into our room dedicated to the great occultist Austin Osman Spare, down past our tropical marine aquarium, into our dark basement of the Wunder Cabinet dedicated to dandies, cabinets of dead birds, cabinets of dead people, fairies, mermaids, a merman, the skeleton of Mortimer the lion from Glasgow Zoo, erotica from all over the world, crustaceans, entomology, old master etchings, skulls, broken children toys, and of course the Gnostic Temple of Agape. Now I can start recording.
This meeting is being recorded.
So tonight, it's such an enormous. It was a great pleasure for me because Gina is an old friend of mine. We met. I don't know how many. Did we meet at when my friend Cappy Grayson curated mail order monsters when you were working at Max Wigram?
That's a long time ago.
And we've bumped in on many occasions.
We have.
Since Gina now works as curator at Camden Arts Centre, which is actually has always been one of my favourite art galleries in London. And I'm so excited she's here to talk to us because she curated, and I remember her talking about it, I think when you came to see me in Norfolk. Anyway, talking about it for a long time for her show on the Botanical Mind, which I missed, as in fact I'm sure lots and lots of people who really wanted to miss it because they had this horrible, endless lockdowns. So it's wonderful and a great pleasure, and I'm hugely excited. It'd be wonderful to hear anybody in the chat. If anyone in the chat went to the exhibition, but perhaps we'll hear more about it in the Q&A. All right, Gina, please.
Thank you, Wyn. Thank you so much for this invitation, and to everyone for turning up here in the virtual realm to listen to me talk. So I'm going to talk through some ideas for about 45 minutes to an hour that have informed my research over the last 5 years, I would say. And as Wynne said, culminated in this exhibition at Camden Arts Centre that I co-curated with Martin Clark, who's the director there. So I'll just start by sharing my screen with you all. And I trust this is working. So the botanical mind, art mysticism, and the cosmic tree departs from the notion of the plant or the vegetal kingdom as a way of kind of reappraising our assumptions, our presuppositions about consciousness and spirituality. So it looks at the plant or the tree as a natural kind of archetype or symbol that's recurred through many global traditions, religions, spiritual practices through time. To really try and understand why plants and the plant kingdom are so bound up with who we are as human beings and our development through a kind of conscious or spiritual realm. So starting with a sort of reflection on classicism to begin with, Botticelli's Primavera, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, shows this kind of understanding that goes right back to Greek mythology and classicism. So here the abundance of nature and of the plant kingdom, the sort of burgeoning growth of spring is personified through these different characters from Greek mythology. So here we see Chloris and the biting wind of March and these flowers coming out of her mouth. And in many other of the Greek myths, we see this sort of transformation or metamorphosis between being human and being plant. So in this case, Daphne, who was pursued by Apollo, the god of sun and light, was transformed into a laurel tree. And also in this image, we can see Myrrha, who was punished for having seduced her father and had intercourse with him. She was punished by being turned into a tree and then gave birth to Adonis from the trunk of her tree. And it's said that the sap, which we sometimes burn in the form of myrrh, this very aromatic substance, was the weeping of her tears for having been punished in this way. So, the vegetal kingdom is really at the heart of many of the stories that we tell about ourselves, to sort of understand where we've come from, our origin stories. And, these go back probably to the beginning of time. If you think about what's so important about the plant kingdom is that it's created the conditions for life to exist on this planet. Plants really perform a kind of alchemy. So they're turning the solar energy of the sun, this pure kind of immaterial light, into matter, literally. They grow and they create their substance, which then provides not only food for us to eat, medicines to heal us, but also the atmosphere that we breathe. So without plants, there would be no animal life. So they've really been there at the foundation of life on this planet. And if you reflect on the way that weeds pop up anywhere that an area of land is left exposed to sunlight and water, these very primal elements of life, you can't really stop the vegetal kingdom springing forth with life. And I think, it's that kind of vitality and sort of unceasing life force that surges through the vegetal kingdom, which has inspired many artists to reflect on why that's so important to us. So going right back to Mesopotamia, the earliest traces of civilization, we've got these extraordinary artworks which show a cosmic tree or a tree of life, a kind of sacred tree, being worshipped by deities. And there are many different sort of friezes of these kind of scenes where we see this tree being worshipped as it grows upwards towards the sun god. So as I said, this relationship between plants and the sun or the heavens in general, actually, the stars and the celestial realm, and as that represents the spirit realm as well, and the heavens. There's this very strong relationship between our life on earth and how we understand ourselves, also connected to this immaterial or transcendent realm. So in ancient Mesopotamia, the culture and civilization there was still very connected to the land and the natural cycles of life. So the stars, the sun, the moon, the waters, these sort of natural movements and cycles, in a way that I think, contemporary life, particularly with scientific materialism in the West, has become quite kind of removed in a way from this more intuitive sort of lived experience of the natural world and feeling those natural cycles. And this exhibition, in a way, and the research that underpins it, reflects on these sort of pre-Enlightenment or kind of worldviews that existed before the scientific revolution and before materialism took hold, to understand the way in which matter and spirituality were at one point understood to be intrinsically bound, before religion was split off from scientific materialism and then perhaps even done away with altogether. The exhibition sort of seeks to revive, through the image of a plant or through the image of a tree, an understanding of spirit being a sort of intrinsic property through all of life, through everything that exists, including what we might understand as being sort of inanimate matter. So Ethel Cahoon was an extraordinary artist. She was an occultist. She was involved with the Surrealist movement, and she was living in London at the time, and then moved down to Cornwall, where she lived in a sort of very intimate relationship with nature, surrounded by ferns, plants that she had a very strong relationship with, and again, the natural cycles of the world around her. And in Cornwall, as many of you may know if you visited there are a lot of megalithic stone structures. So these standing stones, which in a way are kind of astronomical observatories. They're positioned so that as the planet moves through the celestial realm, through the year, these kind of cycles in relationship to the sun are plotted by the relationship of the stars to these standing stones. And if you think about what they represent, these stones which move from a very rooted, sessile position up towards the heavens, they do something very similar to what plants do, because plants, if you think about what differentiates them from animals, are rooted to a place. They're sessile, and that really defines a lot of their behavior and the ways in which they exist and they communicate, and that they perpetuate life. So they use pattern and aesthetics to attract pollinators for them, because they can't move themselves. So there are lots of forms of intelligence in the plant kingdom, which we'll touch on a little bit later, that really come from this ontological fact of being rooted to one place. So this sort of rootedness and orientation up towards the heavens is something which is resembles other forms, for example, a mountain, or human created forms like the minaret or the church spire or the totem pole. These are kind of symbols which are derived originally from nature, which mark this axis from a point in the terrestrial realm, situated in the world of matter, up towards the heavens, towards the celestial realm. And the works in this exhibition really sort of situate the plant with that understanding of this axis, which is often referred to as the axis mundi, or world axis, which kind of symbolizes, but also in a very literal way, enacts this connection between life on earth and what's beyond in the transcendental realm. So just to illustrate that point, and the totem pole, which is a form which is created by many Native American peoples of the Pacific Northwest.
You've got a
Again,
sleep
marks this
too
kind of
there.
surging life force moving up from the terrestrial realm up into the heavens. And these totem poles inspired the surrealist artist Wolfgang Pahlin in the 1930s and 40s to create a series of paintings called totemic landscapes. And for him, he described these totem poles as amongst the greatest sculptural achievements of all time. And really inspired him to think about this kind of animated life force in nature. He was really interested in quantum ideas and this sort of understanding of matter as not being inert in any way, but sort of teeming with life. So many religious traditions also take the form of a tree or plant as a core symbol to understand, again, our relationship to the planet, but also to spirituality. So in mystical Judaism, the tree of life is represented here not in a literal sense as a tree, but as a kind of diagrammatic form to understand the relationship between the unity of the universe, this kind of metaphysical existence, the relationship of that to the creator, to the kind of absolute. And of course, in Christianity, there's a very well-known origin story from the book of Genesis, where two trees, the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life, are both situated right at the beginning of time of humanity, to sort of speak to us about our understanding of who we are, of humanity, of wisdom, and of life and mortality. And what's interesting about that story, which we'll go on to explore a little bit through this talk, is the relationship between the symbol of the tree and the serpent, and why it is
it was
that
just
they're
hanging
interconnected.
by the side of it. That was
So
all.
The story of Eden has inspired many artists, including Hilma F. Klint, who was a Swedish artist, again an occultist, a visionary, very informed by esoteric ideas. And this series of paintings that she made about the tree of knowledge were actually informed very much by the mystical iconography that was inspiring her at the time. So you can see on the right-hand side of this slide an image which really closely resembles these paintings that she was making. And Hilma F. Klint actually started out with botanical illustration.
Yeah,
they were some of her first works as an artist, and then she moved on later into abstraction, and that's really how she became known as an artist. But what inspired her often were these forms from the plant kingdom, these kind of biomorphic forms, spirals, tendrils, these extraordinary shapes and geometries from the plant kingdom, which for her was symbolic and spoke sort of deeper truths than just the ornamental
I took her book, but didn't have a
or
chance
the
to read it.
decorative. So within Christianity, there are many images actually which recur, which show plant imagery in relationship to the different stories and parables from the Bible.
Talk about the Amazonians
and some scholars have speculated that the development of Christianity may have been informed in part
but I don't want to touch it.
by
Get
the
rid of
use
her.
of
you can
entheogenic plant
her up to
medicines.
view
So
options.
entheogenic refers to a kind of mystical experience
No,
with
because I'll
plant
just
hallucinogens or
normally you have it in the
psychoactive
top,
plant
and then
medicines.
this whole thing covers the whole.
To sort of bring about a transcendental state of consciousness or awareness.
No, it's a different mode. No, don't do
the Wasson thesis speculates about this.
Are you sure?
This Psalter from the 12th century.
It depends on their
some of these details.
No,
that shows Christ.
I've been able to get rid of her
with his
stupid
disciples
face in other ones, not
what
her
looked like
particularly, but
these
other
sort of
talkers
overgrown
and just
mushroom
maximise the
forms.
screen. But
and some scholars have
think
speculated
do
that
that.
this is a suggestion that there was a use of psychoactive mushrooms that brought about these transcendental states. So this is really speculative, but has been discussed also by other thinkers like Terence McKenna, who wrote extensively about this, who was arguing that the development of human consciousness took a real leap at a certain point, and that there's sort of some evidence that suggests that may have been because human beings began to consume psychoactive mushrooms at that time. But whatever people take away from this, I think the images themselves are just extraordinary, that these plants have been treated with such sort of attention and this really sort of dazzling, quite kind of psychedelic imagery.
Biscuits open.
So just thinking again about this relationship between the plant and the serpent, these images occur in many different places. So this is a 16th century, very popular at the time, Botanical. It's a kind of encyclopedia which also included images of mythical creatures like dragons. But in this instance, you can see a tree, again entwined with a serpent. And in this image, which shows a kind of esoteric or occult illustration from the 15th century, again, you can see this tree in the center with the serpent winding upwards. So what both those archetypes represent, the serpent and the tree or the plant, is a movement between realms. So again, thinking about this axis mundi idea, of connecting the terrestrial, the lived world of experience, the mundane, to the transcendental. This sort of ladder, which is also kind of present in the Bible, in Jacob's ladder, in the story of Jacob's ladder. It's a kind of movement between realms, or a sort of
so it's him, he always gets drunk,
movement through a shamanic axis. So the plant and the serpent represent this movement.
He gets guest speakers in on a Sunday
this
night.
kind of shift in consciousness or shift in state of being. So the serpent is an animal which sheds its skin and therefore is associated with transformation and regeneration. And in many cases, it's thought to represent eternal life. And if you think of the plant kingdom, it also is known for exactly that quality. It regenerates. It sheds its leaves, which then are decomposed in the darkness of the earth, which then regenerate the soil and allow new life to come through. So this sort of cyclical or regenerative function is really at the core of plants and their being ontologically. And I think that's why these two kind of archetypes of the serpent and the plant are intrinsically bound. So a lot of my thinking for this exhibition came from experiences that I'd had with a particular plant medicine, which is used by indigenous peoples in the Amazon, called ayahuasca. So this is an image of the ayahuasca vine growing naturally. And the way that it's prepared ceremonially is that it's brewed with another plant, chacruna, which has a high quantity of DMT. And the combination of these two plants together allow you to consume enough or to be open enough to be affected by this plant medicine, to bring about these sort of mystical encounters, really, with a spiritual realm. A sort of transcendent state beyond the material world. So it was those experiences that made me look again at the plant kingdom and think differently to how we're sort of habitually taught to understand plants as being sort of semi-inert or definitely without consciousness, let alone spirituality. But the experiences that I had and the way that the context was shaped around these ceremonies that I encountered in the Amazon is that ayahuasca is not only a plant in a physical sense, but it's an entity. It's a important spiritual entity that is revered at the center of their cosmology. So just as the trees in the Garden of Eden have this religious or spiritual significance, so too these particular sacred plants or power plants from the Amazon are revered and worshipped in a similar way. And it's interesting to note also that the ayahuasca vine not only grows in a kind of serpentine form and moves upwards towards the heavens like this axis mundi, but it's associated in a lot of their mythologies with the serpent also. So I spent some time in the Amazon, not only working with these plants, but also learning about the indigenous cultures and their artwork. And I met an artist, Delfina Munoz de Toro, who is an indigenous artist. She campaigns on behalf of indigenous communities. She spent extensive periods of time, particularly with the Yawanawa people, and is really informed by their mythologies. So here we can see a wonderful painting that she made especially for the exhibition, which reflects on this way in which plants are really rooted into the ground, moving up towards the heavens, and surrounded by this abundant vegetal life burgeoning forth. And then again, having this intrinsic relationship with the serpent, so that's coiled around the roots and coiling up this axis towards the heavens. And in the Amazon, the serpent is not seen as a demonic animal. And even though it's a major predator, the anaconda, being a serious predator for humans, it's revered as a sacred animal. And for the Quinn people, the jiboya is understood to bear on its skin the markings and the patterns of all of creation. So these patterns for them are sacred geometries. They're called kene, which means design, but it's a much deeper understanding of what these designs are. It's an understanding that these patterns through nature, including in the plant kingdom, relate to a kind of a unity, something which runs through all beings and all things. So the water, the mountains, the stars, everything that exists in both the material and immaterial realm.
Where's that from?
So we'll talk more about this later in the talk. This idea of pattern and pattern in nature as being a sign of nature's intelligibility and intelligence. And how that connects us to this greater life force, or what may be called the Great Spirit, is something which we can access not only through visual aesthetics but also through music, which is really central to all of the culture of the indigenous peoples in Amazonia that I spent time with.
Look at that.
So this is another
She's
of
not
Delfina's
online,
images, again showing the relationship between the plant kingdom and the serpent. And within Western mythologies and traditions, this motif recurs again. So in Norse mythology, the idea of a sacred tree, the Ash Yggdrasil, that held up the 9 worlds of Norse cosmology, again is bound up with the idea of the serpent. So it's said that the roots of the Yggdrasil was wound around with snakes.
It's the best art.
And this was a motif which inspired Carl Jung very much. So the image on the left-hand side is this tree, Yggdrasil, and you can see at the root this kind of serpentine creature. And then up in the branches, a mandala-like form, which is opening out in the celestial realm, in the heavens. So for Jung, the philosophical tree, or the tree of life, or the cosmic tree, was an archetype, and he wrote a lot about the archetypes as being these forms which recur again and again, that actually kind of shape our collective unconscious. They make us human. They make us be able to communicate intelligibly with each other on a kind of shared basis. So this motif or symbol of the tree being extremely significant to the development of human cultures. So for Jung, the tree seen in profile like this represents the self in a process of growth, in development. And the mandala, which appears in both of these images in the center, is the self seen in cross-section. So if you were looking down on yourself, opening out towards a world which you in part create through the power of your mind. He drew many mandalas in what's now commonly known as the Red Book, originally called the Liber Novus. And these were images that he sought in the depths of his own mind, using this technique that he called creative imagination. So sort of mining these images which are in his collective unconscious, what connects him to the rest of the world. And the mandala always has this formal characteristic of a central point which represents the self, and a world which opens out in sort of centrifugal patterns around it. And the mandala form occurs not only naturally in nature, if you think of the shape of a flower with petals opening out, but occurs also in many religious images, which we'll look at later. And it's inspired many artists also to draw along the lines of these motifs. So Forrest Bess, who was sometimes referred to as an outsider artist from America, but actually wasn't exactly an outsider artist. He was represented by a gallery in New York, but he was a fisherman. So he lived a sort of fisherman in Texas. He lived a kind of unconventional life, perhaps, for an artist.
Ooh, yeah. Hot,
but he was really interested in archetypal images, particularly in Jung's work. He wrote to Jung and asked to correspond with him. He was interested in ideas about alchemy, as was Jung. And for Jung, the notion of alchemy, which is sometimes misunderstood as just being about these sort of practices to transform base metals into gold, for Jung, it was actually about a process of transformation in the self, through the psyche, through the spirit realm. This sort of kind of alchemical process of this sort of intrinsic relationship between the matter of our being and our spiritual selves as well. So these were ideas which really fascinated Forrest Bess as well. And I just wanted to show these two paintings that were in the exhibition because, again, on the left, you see this form, the cosmic axis, or the axis mundi, moving up towards the light, with its base in this kind of a nigredo, or this blackening of the earth. And on the right-hand side, a mandala form. So two sort of archetypes that were very central to Jung's thinking. But just to go through these next images very quickly to demonstrate how many artists through the 20th century and contemporary artists also have been fascinated by these mandala-like forms and integrated them into their work. Scotty Wilson was an outsider artist. Matt Mullican, a contemporary artist who was in the exhibition. And Adolf Wolfli, again, another outsider artist who made these extraordinary mandala-like images when he was actually incarcerated at the time. So mandalas are not only decorative images, but they're really maps of the universe. They sort of explain our place within a world around us. So in this example from the 18th or 19th century in India, I don't know who created this, it's an anonymous work. We can see these rings that are kind of moving out, almost like the rings of a tree if it were cut across its trunk. Moving out, mapping the world, and on the outer edges, these colours symbolising the elements of the natural world. And in the centre, this kind of central axis, again an axis mundi, which in this case is represented by Mount Mertu, which is a sacred representation of the axis mundi. And these mandala forms perhaps are best known as in the Tibetan tradition, where they again symbolize a map of the universe and gateways through realms. So not only the physical world, a map of physical things, as this map is very much speaking of the physical world, of forests and rivers and the natural elements. But in Buddhist practice, it's also a map of the mind and how we navigate the inner realm of our being and our spirituality. The same is true of Hermetic Tantra and these sort of yantric forms, which again open out from a central position, and they're sort of mind maps or guides for meditation in a way. So this idea of a central axis moving up through the terrestrial realm to the heavens above is also embodied in the body. And what we'll go on to talk about in a moment is this principle of microcosm and macrocosm, and the relationship of the human being to the rest of the universe, and how this can be used to understand healing, and in particular plant medicines and healing. So in Kundalini, the axis of the body is understood, or rather represented, by a coiling serpent, which moves up from the base chakra through the different chakras of the body to the crown of the head, where it opens out into a lotus form. And this idea of the body being very much connected with the rest of the universe was something which was a kind of commonplace understanding also in Europe for many centuries. So Hildegard of Bingen, who was a medieval mystic, this is going back sort of 900 years. She was an abbess, a composer of music, some of the most popular choral chants of the medieval period, and a mystic who believed that she had direct communion with God. She even had her own language for communicating with God, the lingua ignota.
Mm.
And for Hildegard, she was really interested in the sort of cosmic principles of the universe. So the wind, the air, the waters, the earth. And this term that she coined, viriditas, which means the greening of the earth, the plant kingdom, almost as a kind of elemental principle. And for Hildegard, this greening was imbued with a spiritual principle. She believed that the greening of plants and the vegetal kingdom had the potential to heal people, to bring about a sense of spiritual attunement. So popular at this time was the idea of humours. So humours were understood to be kind of substances or juices in the body, which derive from the natural elements, so fire, air, earth, and water. And these elements obviously having their counterpart in the heavens, certain planets being associated with, or stars being associated with different energetic principles. And for many centuries, this idea of humoral healing or therapy sought to bring about a kind of attunement between the body and the rest of the cosmos around it. So very much a holistic approach to healing. And certain plants would be associated with these different energies and would be used to bring about a sense of balance in the body. So this humoral theory, which in Europe was much younger than its older counterpart in India, which was and is still practiced as Ayurveda, which is a natural science, which is based in the three humours of Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. So this image on the left-hand side relates to this understanding of the humours in Ayurveda. So within Ayurveda, there are different herbal remedies which are used, again, to sort of bring about this rebalancing of these humours in the body. So this is just another one of Hildegard of Bingen's wonderful illuminations. So she didn't paint these herself, but she had them painted by some of the monastics in her community, but they all relate to her visions that she had in this communion with God. So this one is called Cultivating the Cosmic Tree, and again really shows this sense of the greening of the planet as a healing energy, or a sort of vital life force which can bring about planetary attunement. So there are many botanical documents which sort of chart this relationship between the heavens and the sort of energetic principles of plants and how they can be used for healing. But one of the most beguiling to me when I was undertaking this research was the Voynich manuscript. So this is a 15th century botanical document, which goes far beyond just an encyclopedia of plants, to actually place plants within a wider cosmology, which seems to be imbued with a kind of mystical understanding of the importance of plants. So we can see here, well, the important thing to mention is that it's written in a script which has never been deciphered, and many cryptologists have tried. It's this really fascinating document that the text can't be understood, but the images seem to convey this extremely powerful understanding of the plant kingdom and our connection with it. So here you can see these female bodies that are moving kind of through the vascular networks of plants, moving into their seed pods, moving through the stems, sort of inverting our relationship with plants when we consume them. And what really struck me was the sort of similarity in that symbolism with this detail from Hieronymus Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights, which actually came about 30 years after the Voynich manuscript. And for some time, people were speculating that Bosch may have been the author of the Voynich manuscript. But again, here you see human beings almost being born out of the plants. And on the right-hand side, another image from Hilma F. Klint with a very similar image, this sort of human figure with a spirit-like form coming out of what looks like a kind of bean or a seed pod. So this sort of makes me reflect on the plant kingdom being the kind of origin for human life, and our sort of intrinsic relationship with it. But the Voynich manuscript is full of these really fascinating images of the cosmos, which shows these patterns, which could at the same time be sort of celestial arrangements, as well as the centrifugal shapes of petals in flowers or other plant-like forms. So showing this close relationship of self-similarity across these different spectrum, the spectrum of the microcosmos and the macrocosmos. So just to illustrate this a little bit more, this image from the Voynich manuscript, we start to see these geometries in the plant kingdom, which are often referred to as sacred geometries. And the reason being that these kind of mathematical principles which create these morphologies run right through the whole of creation. So they're thought to be, sometimes they're referred to as the fingerprint of God, but they seem to indicate an underlying creator or a kind of origin or a principle that brings about all of life. So to illustrate this again, you can see the same formation of the golden spectrum here in both weather patterns, celestial arrangements, the shape of a conch shell, and in the arrangement of, or the morphology of a plant. And illustrating a little bit more here how the plant kingdom is really so full of these sacred geometries, perhaps more than any other life form on the planet. Our bodies have these geometries as well, but because we're kind of more complex composites of different types of geometry, but in plants it's much more easy to detect, because in their sort of the way that they construct their form, they take individual units of pattern or shape and they repeat them and repeat them, so they become extrapolated in a way that they're very apparent. So these shapes and patterns have fascinated many artists. Karl Blossfeld was an early pioneer of photography. He adapted photographic equipment so that he could get these incredible close-up details of plant shapes. And he was working against the backdrop of Art Nouveau, which again is informed very much by the kind of spiraling or sculptural forms of the vegetal kingdom. And Ernst Haeckel, who was a polymath, catalogued many of these natural shapes and forms to illustrate how these shapes recurred throughout the different kingdoms of the natural world. So the vegetal, animal, and mineral kingdom all sharing the same
Very
basic
cool, isn't it? The amount of knowledge
units
it's got
of
about
shape.
the topic is
So on the
They've
right hand
just done a
side,
very
huge,
what
impressive.
yeah,
looks
but
like
they've
it
just
could
done a
be a
huge
flower
exhibition.
Yeah,
is
She's had to
actually a
curate. She's had
jellyfish.
to
Yeah,
curate.
Or,
I think it's brilliant. Like,
I do
you know,
too. I think it's
so
great.
again, just looking at
Well, we need
some
to
other examples of
understand
the
the
plant kingdom and
importance
these
of
geometries which occur and then
what we're
occur
what
surrounded
we've
also
got
by.
and what we're
Yeah.
fucking
in
up,
the mineral
basically. Yeah.
kingdom as well.
What we're about to destroy.
Yeah.
So the Vesica Pisces is another what would be referred to as a kind of sacred geometry, and it often occurs also in the Bible or in relation to Christianity. It's referred to as the flower of life, and again shows this kind of idea of infinity through repetition, something which can go on again and again and again. And in this image, just to illustrate again how these basic geometric forms, which you can see on the left-hand side, have their sort of expression or manifestation in both the cosmic realm, the macrocosmos in the center, and the microcosmos in these sort of biological microscopic images. So this idea of pattern, which occurs very much in the vegetal kingdom as being an indicator of a divine principle, or something indicating a kind of spiritual, a sort of generative spiritual force, is something which is very much taken up in Islamic aniconic imagery. So taking the arabesque and really looking at the kind of natural vitality in the art world, in the vegetal kingdom, and celebrating that as a sort of demonstration of this this underpinning vital force which feeds all of life. And again, thinking about patterns and how they point not only to the physical world and what we might think of as being decorative or just everyday in a mundane sense, fractal geometries, which take the idea again of self-similarity, so the microcosm and macrocosm. Fractals take a single unit of pattern and repeat it on different scales, so it can be extrapolated in both directions of scale, so going towards infinity on the largest scale and then repeating down and down into the smallest, but never reaching a conclusion. So if you went into any area of detail in this image, you would see this fractal being regenerated and regenerated. So within this, I mean, this is a geometry which is mathematically generated, and it indicates this kind of the idea of infinity in a way which is manifest here and now in the form of an image. So fractals occur in the vegetal world. This is an example. This is a Romanesco broccoli.
They are amazing.
And also
stunning,
in the
isn't it?
mind,
They're
when
disgusting
people
to
take
eat.
psychoactive plant or
Doesn't taste like
fungal
cauliflower
medicines.
at all.
So particularly with
very bitter.
psilocybin or ayahuasca, these fractal images are often associated with psychedelic experiences and psychedelic imagery. Bruce Conner, an artist very much associated with the countercultural movement on the West Coast in America, created this collage image, again, very much based on this idea of this sort of psychedelic image. So the importance of geometry and its relationship to the mind and spirituality was something, that back in antiquity was not separated at all. So the study of the natural world and the understanding of theology were not sort of separated off. They informed each other. And one of the sort of paradigms through which that was understood was music of the spheres. So this was an idea which can be traced back to Pythagoras, who observed that the diatonic scale, which he formalized, was mathematically, it had a kind of geometric relationship to mathematics that could be expressed musically. So on the left-hand side here, we can see a tuning fork. And the idea is here that there's an upper sphere and a lower sphere. And this monochord, which runs from the kind of heavens, again, the immaterial, down into the sort of dense world of dark matter, can be tuned so that as you move through it, there are different notes which resonate. And this was related to the movement of the planets in the heavens, their revolutions, their mathematical principles, right down to the sort of harmony that we can detect when we listen to music and within our own bodies. So the relationship between form and music has been explored, from this origin and the idea of music of the spheres with Pythagoras, right through until Robert Flood, 2,000 years later, was still talking about this kind of implicit harmony in the universe, that the universe is brought about by these kind of resonant frequencies that we are all part of, we partake in it, and we can recognise this sense of harmony
together as well,
seek
like,
to bring
from
about.
fractals to the
And in more
cymatic,
recent technologies,
really
cymatic
guide,
images
yeah.
Translate the vibrational energy from a particular sound into a visual form. So it takes a kind of standing wave form and translates that into an image. And what's interesting with these images is that they take on the form of a mandala. So again, thinking about this central point that opens out very much like a flower. And Margaret Watts Hughes, who also experimented with this idea of sound being translated into form. She used her own voice with an instrument that she created to again translate these vibrations into material form. So these are ideas which really interested me in thinking about plants, in particular because of the time that I spent in the Amazon. And one of the visual forms that I was most struck by were these designs that are typical for the Shipibo-Konibo people. So they're these sort of labyrinthine forms which are either woven or embroidered on textiles or painted onto ceramics, which for them relate to, as with the images that I showed in the beginning of the Huni Quinn people, really relate to this sense that there's the universe is interlaced with these geometries. And these are really central to the work that they make with ayahuasca to bring about healing. So in their ceremonies, they sing music, icaros, which are healing songs, to tune the vibrations in the body to become harmonic, so that illness, these kind of areas which have become disharmonious and that could bring about sickness or malady in the body, can be realigned through the music that vibrates them. So it's said by some people that these geometries that have visual form also have a musical form, and that the two relate. And some of the visions that people experience when they're working with ayahuasca relate very much to these patterns. And it's thought that the Shipibo-Konibo people have created these patterns through their work with ayahuasca. They're very much intrinsically bound to that work. And these sacred geometries and patterns vary from different groups to different groups that I was spending time with. But the principle kind of remains the same, that in this case with the Yawanawa people, the beadwork or the patterns that they paint onto their skin are in no sense arbitrary or just decorative. They're all derived from the rainforest, from different entities that could be animal, could be plant, could be elemental, could be the wind or the river. And what they're calling is for the sort of spiritual essence of these entities to be sort of distilled in a way in these geometries, that they're worn as talismans that can summon the energy of these different entities that they may need for healing in their ceremonies, or at different times for protection. So these patterns are really extraordinary and all derived from the natural world. So these, or this idea of pattern being a kind of language, something which can communicate across kingdoms of the natural world, from animal to vegetal, the patterns of plants attracting insects or birds to pollinate for them. This also inspired 20th century artists Annie Albers and Joseph Albers, who spent time in America in the interwar period. And they spent a lot of time in the pre-Columbian sacred sites, particularly in Mexico, but also Peru. And Annie Albers was in particular inspired by these geometries in these sacred sites and those being woven by the Andean textile weavers. So she considered this to be amongst one of the most sophisticated languages that she'd encountered, that it was a form of ancient writing which could communicate. And just to show you here some of the patterns that were informing them. This was one of the most sacred sites in Mexico, a pre-Columbian archaeological site at Mitla. So these formations that we're looking at symbolize the sacred serpent again. And another 20th century artist associated with the Surrealist movement was also informed by sacred geometries of Native American peoples, in particular the Navajo. So again, these geometries for the Navajo people are not just decorative. They're not decorative at all. They relate very much to their cosmology, their understanding of their place in the natural world. So just to finish with a few images of artists who've been really inspired by these patterns and geometries in the plant world. Philip Taff, an American artist whose practice is very much inspired by the natural forms, not only in the plant kingdom, but throughout nature, but also looking at how those forms have been extrapolated in different cultural traditions. So from sort of Viking shapes to Celtic forms, pre-Columbian forms also. And interestingly, many outsider artists, as I was doing my research, I was finding that vegetal motifs seem to be quite central to the work of a lot of outsider artists. So Hilma F. Klint, who I mentioned earlier, often would make work from plant meditations. She would study plants. Anna Haskell, a Czech artist, was making these quite kind of heraldic images derived from plant forms. Anna Zemenkova, another Czech artist, who would make a plant portrait every morning, kind of tuning into the sort of spiritual presence of the plant. And again, looking at these very almost kind of musical forms that take different elements of the plant shape and extrapolate them into sort of repetitions and patterns. So that's all I'm going to say. That's about an hour. But there's a lot more to say about the ideas in this project, and we'll have some time now for questions. But just to let you know that there is a book that is available at the Camden Arts Centre website. These are some of the spreads from that book. So if you want more information or just to delve a little bit deeper into some of the ideas, please have a look there. And there's also still this kind of expanding archive that we created online when we went into the first lockdown here in the UK. We were due to open the exhibition in April last year and had to cancel at the very last minute. So all of the research that underpins the exhibition seemed rich enough to create this kind of online platform to expand on some of those ideas. So we commissioned a series of podcasts. There are some artist commissions in there, but it really goes into a lot more depth than I can today. So please visit that. It's the link is in the bottom here, botanicalmind.online.
Well, thank you so very much. if
That's funny,
we
isn't
could
it?
have a virtual round of applause, and please, if anyone has any questions, please pop them in the Q&A, which is at the bottom. How did the show go there? I mean, did you get any? I kept, thinking I'm going to come to it next week, and then it happened. What was it like?
We managed to open it in September, and the response was extraordinary. So even though we had all of the COVID measures in place, everyone had to book, we had to limit entry, timed admission. We had more visitors than we had in that same season the year previously. So it was extremely well attended. And then sadly, we had to close again when the second lockdown happened in November. And we didn't reopen. So it was much shorter than expected, sadly. But at least some people got to see it. And one of the most disappointing things was that we were working with the Yawanawa people to bring 4 of their artists over from the Amazon rainforest, and they were going to paint this extraordinary mural, this wall painting based on their sacred geometries, and to share their music and speak about life and their cosmology in the Amazon. And we couldn't do that because they were self-isolating in their village. So there were some things which couldn't happen.
I did actually to ask you what they thought of the exhibition and their work being in it. Did they get a copy of the catalogue, or did they understand the sort of context and everything?
I don't really think they if they'd have come, I think they would have grasped what it really was. But I think it's very hard to convey this kind of project with this kind of format of a talk, an illustrated talk. Then that's quite easy to put these ideas across. But communicating with a very remote community in the Amazon with extremely limited access to the internet is, a lot of it was done. It was liaised in the time that I was there, and I was also working with Delfina Munoz de Toro, one of the artists that I mentioned, who was living with them for a time. So a lot of the communication was through her. So sadly, no, I don't think. It's one of my disappointments about this project was that we couldn't really bring that to fruition in a proper way. But there might be other opportunities down the line.
There was a museum in Canada did this amazing project where they brought some CPIC artists over, and then had first of all they took some West Coast Native American artists over to the CPIC, and then they brought the CPIC artists back, and they made work. I should send you the link.
Oh, please, yeah.
Now, have we got any questions, please? Mama Creatives is saying that she did a collaborative performance with some amazing artists at Aberystwyth Art Centre called Inseparability of Human and Nature. We used a device to tap into electromagnetic frequency of the plants, cymatics, a dandelion song, stories and dance, poetry, mandala, art.
Oh, sounds wonderful. I'll look that up.
Heather, I've never had a talk where there's no one questions. There's a lot of people. Come on, someone must have. Aha. Well, is there an e-version of the exhibition catalogue?
There isn't at the moment, but we have been talking about doing an e-book.
But it will be available in libraries as well, mustn't it?
It will be available so we work with Art Data, who distribute our books, and they do get them around the libraries. So yeah, it should be available for people to look at. EM is asking what you mean by outsider artists. Outsider artist is a term. It's actually a difficult term. It means self-taught usually. So an artist that is kind of outside the mainstream really. So outside of the system of education or gallery representation. often outsider artists seem to be associated with a kind of spiritualist practice, or so
Gets
something
divisive,
which
isn't it?
something else which is driving their practice,
bullshit
that is
as
not
well.
just
Yeah, it's
about
bullshit.
the kind of canonical understanding of art history.
James Brett, who has the Museum of Everything, told me that every artist comes rushing up to him to tell him that they're an outsider.
It's hilarious, isn't it?
There's a question asking, are there any films that you would say fall into this tradition?
Films? In outsider artists?
Well, no, I think probably more about back on the Botanical Mind.
Oh, okay, Botanical Mind. Well, I'd recommend watching The Embrace of the Serpent, which gives a kind of insight into some of the mythologies from the Amazon, in particular in relationship to ayahuasca. That's a really good film. Came out about 5 years ago.
Where can it be watched?
What's that?
How can you watch it?
Yeah, we've seen
It's on Prime Video.
It's really
easy
good.
to get.
I thought it was really
There's
good.
a brilliant documentary called Juliet of the
seen this,
Herbs, which is about a traditional herbalist who lived on an island. I think she was living in Sicily or somewhere in the Mediterranean, but she really speaks about this more traditional understanding of plants and their power and how to work with them. So that's a really beautiful film. And anything by Terence McKenna, can get loads of his stuff on YouTube, talks mainly, but there's some good material by Terence, sadly no longer around.
Nancy Hasselbacher is asking, what area of the world would you like to continue to explore this subject in?
Oh, definitely Europe, because my research was really inspired by the time that I spent in the Amazon, but what that allowed me to do was look at our own traditions and the trajectory from our sort of intellectual ancestors in ancient Greece through to this movement into a very materialistic worldview where we've lost touch, in a sense, with this animistic understanding of nature. So I want to look at those more traditional plant practices here, herbalism, and not only restricting that to plants actually, but to more kind of animist ideas about the landscape. So I did do some research in Ireland and some in Finland, actually, into these sort of indigenous ideas of plant wisdom. But I'd like to continue that, and probably Australia, actually. I'd like to continue it there.
Ruth Hogg is asking, do you think that there could be a literal link between the cosmic tree symbol and expanded consciousness, in that many ayahuasca ingredients come from trees?
Definitely. Yeah, I think I think that the cosmic tree or the axis mundi, it's a symbolic form, but those symbols probably derived from somewhere, right? So the example I gave of how plants are performing this alchemy by transforming the immaterial realm of light and energy into matter, they are actually doing something pretty mystical right in front of our eyes.
That's what we watched.
And the realms that they open up with
that 3-part thing.
Psychoactive
Really heavy, but
enzymes and substances is really extraordinary. So I really think of it changed the way I thought about plants, my experiences with not only ayahuasca but other sort of power plants. I think it's worth reappraising how we think of them as a sort of lower life form.
Amber is asking if you think there is a growing interest at the moment within contemporary art and contemporary culture in mysticism, spiritualism, or renewed interest, and if so, why?
I do think so, and I've sort of tracked that since working on this show. So when I first came up with the idea for it, I was reluctant to talk to anyone because I thought they would kind of laugh me out of the room if I said I wanted to do an exhibition about plants and spirituality and pattern and music. But as time developed, actually, the culture around the show also shifted, and I found it, the community was extremely receptive. In a way, there's a great appetite, I think, to be talking about these ideas. And I think there's a sort of crisis of spirituality that people are now beginning to address, that it's okay to talk about spirituality without irony. And I think, there have always been artists practicing in this way, which this exhibition reveals, Hilma F. Clint, Ethel Cahoon, so many artists through the 20th century who were informed by spiritual ideas. But, now they're really coming to the fore, whereas at the time they would have been outsider, as we refer to it, or definitely didn't get the attention that they're now getting.
Justine is saying, have you seen any botanical art which specifically responds to environmental threats or crises?
Nothing that comes immediately to mind, but I'm sure that there are. If I think of anything afterwards, I'll let you know when you can maybe pass it on.
I know, I'm trying to think. There's an artist whose work I like who's done a whole series of photographs of seeds of plants which are up in the frozen plant vault. But again, it'll come to my mind. Marianne McCarthy is asking, where was the Voynich manuscript made? Do we know who made it?
So no, we don't know who made it. It's named after an antiquarian book dealer who bought it, I think, in 1912. It's got a really interesting provenance. So it was at one point in the court of some emperor or someone that was very interested in occult ideas, and he had this occult library. And John Dee at one time conveyed it. I think it was in the Elizabethan courts, and he took it into mainland Europe. So it's had, and Kircher, I think, had some involvement with it. So it's always kind of fascinated
I just want to upload
people in the sort of alchemical,
yeah, that makes sense. Yeah,
because it's from my
esoteric circle.
But
no one knows who authored it. And they think that it was made in Italy, northern Italy, because they noticed that some of the buildings that are depicted have this sort of swallow